Greetings and bienvenue, MITZU. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Have you ever believed something for years and years, only to learn later that your memory of the event is pretty much completely wrong? Because that happened to me just last week when an old friend, Cam, came by. We used to be pretty good friends back when we were little tykes, running around outside and just generally being annoying kids. We had a falling out when we were teenagers and didn't talk for ages, but patched things up later as adults. Turns out he'd managed to cobble together a nice life for himself, moving out of what turned out to be, abusive parents' house at 16, got a job, an apartment, and just generally was in far better a place than he'd been previously. Me, not so much. That college degree that I supposedly needed to get a job wasn't and still hasn't paid jack shit. Anyway, he dropped by last week to pay a visit and talk about job openings he'd seen somewhere. We ended up just shooting the shit more than anything, though somehow we came to the topic of our childhood. Back when we used to roam the neighborhood doing kid stuff. I've got to admit, a lot of my memories of that are pretty vague. Cam, on the other hand, remembered a lot of things clearly as day. According to him, when I was around 6 or so, I was a controlling little monster. Had my own ideas about how things were to be played, what we were going to play at all, etc. He didn't outright call little Cranapple a bully, too nonviolent for it, he said, but I got the impression that I was pretty miserable to be around, and the only reason he played with me at the time was because I was the only other kid his age in the neighborhood. Man, and then like July of that summer we went down to the creek and you kept dragging me further and further out into the woods. Remember that, he had said. I remembered the event only minimally, but I distinctly recalled him dragging me out there and told him as much. Before I continue, I think I should describe a bit of the area I live in. Our house is on top of a hill in a cozy, out-of-the-way little lower middle class neighborhood on the edge of town. It's very much a suburb, though far from a fancy one. There are still hints of wilderness nearby, small wooded areas being pretty much all around. Deer are quite a common sight. Across the street from our house is, well, another house of course. Their backyard is mostly flat until the very end of it, which slopes down steeply into a wooded hillside. It extends down quite a ways into what is effectively a floodplain for a nearby creek. A fair portion of the plain itself is devoid of trees, though I think that's due to the owner of that land keeping them from growing more than any natural process. At the far end of this floodplain is the start of a wooded area of indeterminate size which hides the creek in question. What, you don't remember? Every time I suggested going back, you were like, no. Keep going forward. Actually, you were kinda scared about it, Cam countered. That's pretty weird for me, actually. Even at the age of 6, I pretty much hated being surrounded by nature. Nature meant bugs, bugs meant spiders and bees, spiders and bees meant me screaming and crying and running the hell away. I've never minded the outdoors in and of itself, I just hate being out in undeveloped areas. Cam went further into detail on our little trek. He'd led us down the hill initially, then started pushing for us to follow the nearby creek as far we could go. We found the creek easily enough. It was plainly visible when you were underneath the trees and started following it, moving through the honestly not that thick underbrush alongside it. My friend was all for the adventure at first, but the further we went the more hesitant to continue he became. He started pressing for us to go back, my response always being some flavor of, no. We've got to go further. He said it was a bit unnerving after a while. I'd never once cared for our adventures into wooded areas before. But now I was into it. More than into it, he said I was practically obsessed with going forward. Like I had some goal in mind. He'd had enough after a certain point and told me in no uncertain terms that he was going to turn around and go home. Then I hit him. One fist to the gut that knocked the wind out of him, sending him face first into what he later found out was poison ivy. That is beyond unusual for me. I'm pretty gentle, always have been. I didn't even try to fight back against anyone threatening me until at least 5th grade. Hell, Cam tended to use that against me when I was being particularly controlling. He'd threatened to hit me, knowing I'd probably stop because I hated violence. For me to haul off and punch him like that was beyond unusual. It was practically out of character. He'd already known me for almost 2 years at this point. He knew that I didn't do that sort of thing. My friend continued, saying that I picked him back up and was extremely apologetic about it. He said I was practically sobbing, saying, "I'm so sorry," over and over again. He doesn't remember what he said to me to get me to stop, but what I replied with stopped him cold. My sobbing apologies ceased immediately and I said simply, "Good." But he swears he isn't shitting me about this. My voice was weird. Like some kind of double voice thing is how he described it. As if there were another voice underneath mine, masked by it but identifiable. He was sufficiently scared by what he swears he heard that he just followed me without question at that point. We were eventually found by the neighbor from across the street, who had been asked to help find us. When we passed by a thin line of trees that led to an open area with a road up atop a sloping hill up ahead, another incline covered in trees to our right, in other words, we were back where we had started. As if we'd never actually gone anywhere. The sun was starting to go down, too, so it's not like we hadn't actually been walking along the creek for hours. According to Cam, the moment our neighbor started calling for us, I just sort of froze. Like if I stood still enough, she wouldn't see me. She did, of course, and dragged me out of the woods pretty much literally. I refused to move a muscle until we were on the road. As I said, I recalled him pushing me on and definitely didn't remember punching him. He had a bruise to prove it to our parents, so I got the brunt of the blame and was grounded for a while. No TV for a week, a lifetime to a little kid. We didn't hang out around each other for a while, maybe a month. He said he was afraid of me after what happened, but eventually chalked the whole thing up to his childish imagination. Little Cranapple was obviously just being a particularly aggressive little jerkass that day. That wasn't the last time he'd encounter something unusual around that creek, though. Hell, he'd stopped thinking of our little creek adventure as unusual until other things started happening down there. He didn't really have time to get into it during his visit, though. After he'd left, I talked to my grandmother about the event. She was my legal guardian growing up, so she'd probably have a perspective on it worth hearing. She remembered and corroborated the part about the bruise on Cam's stomach and the poison ivy on his face, and how I froze like a deer in a car's headlights after our neighbor found us, refusing to move the whole way up the hill. I'm going to try and get in contact with Cam later this week, see if I can't pry the other weirdness out of him. No guarantees, he's kind of a busy guy these days. So it took a while to get Cam to open up about some of the other oddities that went on down by that creek. He was a bit nervous about it, actually, which was surprising given how quickly he delved into the last story. That's not why it's taken so long to post more, though that's just me procrastinating. Anyway, he told me about 3 incidents over the years that pretty much convinced him to leave that creek alone, no matter what. The first incident occurred about 4 years after the original creek incident. Cam was 9 at the time and we were still talking, albeit spending a lot less time together. Mostly Cam's fault there, he admits. He'd become the controlling one and was more than willing to physically force me to do what he wanted at the time. So I started spending a lot more time indoors and a lot less time being coerced into climbing trees and jumping out of them. Man, I was such a doormat back then. So without me there to play with, Cam had to try and do things on his own. And that he did mostly running around the woods nearby, camping out in his backyard, swimming in a friendly neighbor's pool, shooting stuff with his BB gun, all sorts of things really. Then one day in the summer. He thinks it was not long before school restarted for the year, so sometime in August. Cam decided to go camping down by the creek. It was apparently owned by some old guy, maybe a farmer or something, but he never came around to do anything with the land. So the chances of getting caught trespassing for the night were pretty slim. Cam's always been the camping sort and would strike a tent in his backyard sometimes just because he loved it so much. So he was pretty comprehensive with his preparations, for a 9-year-old anyway. He grabbed the littlest tent they had, a 1-person thing that could probably have supported 2 kids, some snacks, 2 boxes of fruit by the foot and drinks, ecto cooler, blankets, sleeping bag, a pillow, a couple flashlights, anti-mosquito spray, anti-wasp and hornet spray, because screw those things, his BB gun, and the most important thing of all, his Game Boy. Yep, he was prepared to rough it out there by a creek that wasn't even half a mile away from his house. Now, that was a lot of stuff and he couldn't take it all in one trip, so he hauled the tent down there first and set it up in a little spot he'd found that was mostly hidden by underbrush and foliage, just in case Old Man Farmer or whoever decided to drop by. While putting his tent up, Cam noticed the water in the creek was unusually calm. Actually, it looked stagnant. Weird, but he wasn't the type to be put off by a minor detail like that. Who the hell cares if a creek's flowing or not? That's not what he was there for. He was gonna camp and get the hell away from his myriad siblings for at least one night before school starts. With the tent up and ready, Cam threw the stuff he could carry along into the tent and then left to retrieve the rest of his utterly vital equipment. He had a surprisingly hard time getting out of the woods, though. According to him, he went in circles for at least an hour before finally getting his bearings enough to leave the trees behind. These aren't exactly thick woods, nor is the creek far from their edge. So Cam was pretty annoyed at himself for getting lost somehow. He makes it back to his little camp just as evening is starting to settle in, so he hops into his tent and partakes of a delicious, highly nutritious dinner of fruit by the foot and ecto cooler. As night fell and the bugs settled into their nightly routine of making a horrendous racket, Cam played some Tetris or something on his Game Boy while using a flashlight to see the pea soup-colored screen. At some point he fell asleep. Just before dawn, Cam woke up pretty abruptly. Which is unusual for him. He's a slow waker who will sit around in bed for half an hour before he can actually get up and function decently. It took him a moment to realize he was in a tent and that the pain in his shoulder was the Game Boy, which he'd rolled onto in his sleep. It was so dark that he was effectively blind, so he searched around for the flashlight, tried to turn it on. Nothing. Batteries were dead, probably because he'd fallen asleep with it still on. By this point, Cam was beginning to feel tense. But he chalked it up to waking up in a tent in the dark with a Game Boy lodged into his shoulder at a weird angle. Cam tried to go back to sleep, but there was still something bugging him. It was that turn of phrase that clued him in on what was weird. There were no insects. Or at least they were all dead quiet. In the summer. That was a little freaky, so he thought at the time. He'd never really been awake at whatever o'clock it was at the time though, so maybe bugs went to bed. He certainly didn't know. Curiosity was swelling though, and he had to investigate, see what was going on. Digging around blindly in the dark, Cam located the other flashlight and used it to help put on some shoes. Then he left the tent, being sure to be slow and quiet about it. It felt like any noise at all could be for miles, it was that silent. Once outside, he whirled his flashlight around to get a decent look at his surroundings. Not much that he could see other than trees and dirt. Not even gnats flying around in the flashlight beam. He spent a few minutes looking around before briefly lowering the beam down into the creek itself, which failed to reflect anything and remained pitch black. It took a moment to register, and Cam had moved the beam up into the trees again before he noticed. Then he lowered it again, and still the creek's water failed to reflect anything. It was less terrifying and more confusing to him at the time. That was unusual, he remembers thinking about it. Curiosity still getting the better of him, Cam searched for a rock or twig or something and tossed it at the water. The object, he doesn't remember what it was, stayed visible until it hit the pitch black water. Then it just vanished and didn't even make a sound. Like he'd thrown it off a cliff or something. That's when dread started overriding curiosity. The sheer unnaturalness of what was going on had finally hit him, and he didn't really want to stick around the reflectionless creek that ate things, or whatever the hell it really was. Cam turned back to start gathering his stuff out of the tent, only to freeze in place when something made a sound. A rustling in the underbrush on the other side of the creek. Cam listened, fighting the dread filling his gut. No other sounds. More rustling, then were those footsteps. Cam certainly didn't stick around to find out. He took off, sprinting through the woods as fast as he could without slamming into a tree. He made a beeline for his house once he emerged. His family was certainly surprised to see him pounding on their front door at 3:30 a.m. wearing pajamas and carrying only a flashlight. After they got him calmed down, he tried to explain the weird thing that happened. None of them believed him, and his parents rolled their eyes and told him to get to bed. The next morning he rushed out of the house to grab his stuff from the tent, but when he made his way to the creek he couldn't find it. Actually, he couldn't even find where the tent had been. He spent hours searching for it. It had his Game Boy after all. He'd worked hard to get enough money to buy that thing. But he never found it, the tent, or even the place he'd set up camp. Again, nobody believed him, and his parents were particularly furious that he'd concoct a story like that to explain why he'd lost a bunch of stuff. Like that tent. That thing had been expensive. I actually remember this happening somewhat. My grandmother talked to his mother about it over the phone. They both had a good long laugh about the crazy story he'd expected people to buy, and I remember thinking that I would never ever lose my Game Boy like that. I also remember his brothers teasing him over losing a whole tent sometime in the future, can't recall when exactly.
This next post was written by the same goon of the previous two. It's unrelated, as he recounts a dream.
Dreams are funny things. Most people experience them passively, having little to no conscious effect on what happens in them. Usually dreams up being a lot like a movie because of that. Then there are lucid dreams, the ones where you're 100% aware that you're in a dream and you're effectively a god, limited only by the thin barrier between the dream world and the real one. Finally, there's those strange dreams that shift between the two, jumping from lucidity to just watching what's going on and back again. I call them semi-lucid dreams, though who knows if they have a proper name. Anyway, I've had plenty of non-lucid dreams. They tend to be a lot of fun and really weird. Heck, I sometimes have sequential non-lucid dreams. Like episodes of a nutty TV show if they made a grand total of 4 episodes in 15 years. There's really nothing quite like experiencing the night of the Meet Jigglers episode IV about 6 years after the last one. Not many true nightmares to be had in this category, at least for me. There have been a few, but I don't remember enough from any of them to give details. But I used to yearn to have a true lucid dream. To soar through space, jump buildings like Superman, stuff like that. I tried all sorts of techniques to actually induce lucidity, and none of them ever worked. Sometimes I could induce semi-lucidity through what I can only describe as sheer force of will. Like, if something is going horribly wrong in my dream, I can sometimes correct it just by wanting it hard enough. Someone's dying suddenly, I have the power to save them. There are zombies around suddenly, I have a weapon capable of mowing them down. It's interesting but not quite the magical adventures usually ascribed to lucid dreaming. I did achieve what seemed to be true lucidity once and only once thus far. Not sure I ever want to again. As to why, that lies in the details of the dream I had one day back in November of 2010. It started completely out of my control. There was demon, or something like a demon, stalking my childhood neighborhood. I and most of my extended family were its target, I guess. We stayed indoors, plotting a way to defeat it and get our lives back. We tried guns, we tried running it the hell over with a car. We even tried calling the police, who predictably laughed at us. So there we were, fighting for our lives against a demon that toyed with us and drew us out of our homes one by one so it could pick us off. It was at that point I think I started to force my will upon the dream. The demon went from completely invincible to avoiding the light. We shattered one of its wings with a shotgun. Then I gained the ability to shoot lasers out of my fingers. Then suddenly everybody in my family had the power to do that, and so we fought back hard and defeated the demon. We celebrated in nonsensical dream ways that I can scarcely remember. It was glorious. It all started to change right around that point, though. My family members began to dwindle with no explanation, but it's a dream, so people disappearing is hardly unusual. Then I noticed someone different was with us, someone who I realized had been there the whole time and I hadn't noticed. It was a woman, probably about 60 or so I suppose. Middle-aged at least. She was quite attractive for a woman her age, with very few wrinkles, pale skin with rosy cheeks, and long dirty blonde hair tied in a tight bun. She wore a very formal, archaic blue dress that wouldn't have looked out of place in a European monarch's court some centuries ago. As I noticed her, something changed and I noticed my surroundings in a way I hadn't before. I was lucid, fully aware of my surroundings and that this was actually a dream. Suddenly I was incredibly excited to finally be experiencing this thing I'd heard described so intensely in the past. So I started trying to do things, ignoring my rapidly dwindling family and the unknown woman. I began to fly, picking up cars and throwing them like toys, and basically going on an all-around power trip. It was amazing, astounding, and too good to be true. After getting my fill of being a demigod, I noticed finally that there was only the woman left. My entire family had vanished from the dream. Still feeling the rush of being the great demigod Krampus kid, I decided to try and summon them back with my awesome powers. They didn't reappear. Actually, it was worse than that. The entire area, what had once been my home and neighborhood, was instead engulfed in fog that seemed to strip everything away. Everything save for that woman. I wasn't unnerved and I'm not sure why. Maybe it was the power or maybe it was something else. Whatever the case, I had decided it was time to see what was going on with the weird lady who was still there, standing in a void of fog. What the hell is going on here? I think I yelled at her. I remember it sounding like more of a whisper than anything, though. Can pretty easily be chalked up to my actually talking in my sleep, I suppose. I started to stomp towards her threateningly and tried to will her away. It didn't work. Why are you still here? She just smiled at me as I approached. You're just a dream. Why aren't you gone? I tried to scream at her, but again it came out as a whisper. Then she grabbed my throat so fast I didn't even register that she'd moved. To me it was like she had gone from standing straight with her arms at her side to grasping my throat tightly. And for all the amazing things I was supposedly capable of, all of the awareness I supposedly had, nothing could get her to let me go. Then she leaned in, or did she pull me closer, and said to me,
"You always wanted this. Now it'll be all you have. Your life is mine and my dreams are yours."
I have vague recollections of us struggling. I don't know who won or if there even was a winner. I remember waking up, sweating and probably more tired than when I had gone to sleep. The sun was just starting to light the room, so I said fuck it to going back to sleep and just got up. Nothing really changed between that night of sleep, so I think it really was just a weird, terrifying, meta dream. That's what makes me most comfortable, anyway.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.